Excellent. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Meera Alagajara, the Associate Editor for Human Resource Development Review, and for our journal for the 2021 Elwood F. Holton Award. Winners, we have the authors of the best paper that won through what we would say was a very systematic and a rigorous process for selecting the best published article for 2021. And the authors are Kristi Kaeppel, Robin Grenier, and Emma Björngard-Basayne. And the article was titled "The F Word, the Role of Women's Friendships in Navigating the Gendered Workplace of Academia." This article is particularly exciting, I think, in terms of today's context and what's been going on for a couple of years, especially in the radar across different countries. A very common global theme is about women's friendships, about how important it is for creating or valuing feminine values, and in a way that these friendships can actually reduce the effects of workplace marginalization. And I think also, particularly within higher education and within academia, their paper has exciting implications, especially for how organizations or how universities, how our own colleges can actually provide structures of support or infrastructures that can help women's friendships as a way to also enhance scholarly work. It can increase productivity, but all through, positive ways, through friendships, relationships, and all of the good work that can come through social networks and friendships. All right, so that didn't go well. I'll edit a little bit out and I'll bring something here. So
wow, that was a great synopsis of our research. Yeah, you did the hard part for us.
Yeah. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to our award-winning authors, and each one of them are going to introduce themselves to us today.
Okay, so I'll get started. My name is Kristi Kaeppel. I am currently a faculty member at St. George's University in Grenada in the West Indies. When I wrote this paper, I was a PhD candidate at University of Connecticut studying adult learning.
Okay, and I am Emma Björngard-Basayne. I am an adjunct philosophy professor at UConn Stanford, and I'm also an academic advisor in the School of Business.
And I'm Robin Grenier. I'm an associate professor of adult learning in the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of Connecticut. I was Kristi's advisor when we started this project. And I happen to be Emma's former instructor for a college instruction course, which is actually where Emma and Kristi met.
Well, thank you all for your introductions, and also really setting up a background and a context for your work. And so for us to get started today, I'm curious to find out what drew you all into exploring transformative role of women's friendships in academia.
Sure. Yeah. So I can start out. So really, I think it began with an observation of what was happening in Emma and I's own friendship. So, oh, did she just leave? Oh no, she's there. I'm sorry. I just saw you drop. I thought you dropped off the call. My bad. I'm sorry.
Oh,
you're muted.
So this is what I wanted to do is, as soon as you all start talking, I want to get out of this thing, so then the focus becomes yours and not like me in between.
We were just worried about you.
I thought you dropped off the call. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with Teams. We're using an app, but so you get used to it.
Hold on a second. Let me charge my computer too. All right. So let me start with the question again, because
act two, yeah.
Act two, yeah.
Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, very good. Thank you all for your introductions. I really wanted us to get started with some background and context. What drew you into exploring the transformative role of women's friendships in academia?
I think it started with Emma and I's own observation of what was happening in our friendship. So we met in a course at the University of Connecticut when we were both graduate students. And I was a new graduate student, and I think still struggling with my own feelings of self-efficacy and whether or not I was really a scholar. And Emma had disclosed after we became friends that she had some similar fears and reservations. But we saw that as we became friends and as we did work together, that our confidence started to build, and that enabled us to initiate projects. We led some teaching seminars together. We presented at conferences together, which was a big step for us. And we knew that we had to do that as part of our scholarly development. So we were just sort of watching this own process happen within ourselves through the kind of nurturing of the friendship, and wondering then, okay, well, have other women experienced this in academia where their friendship has enabled them to kind of do scholarly activities that they were too timid or not yet confident enough to do together. So that led us to want to look into, see if there was research on this topic. And yeah, that's where we got started.
Yeah, I think one thing too that, before I started collaborating with Kristi, and I know Kristi has shared that she felt in a similar way, that I didn't even really think of myself as an academic. But once we started collaborating, that type of identity formation really started taking place, and it built a lot of confidence. And then, we talked about it and decided to pitch our idea to Robin, and I just remember being like super nervous, and we had a lunch meeting. We had practiced ahead of time and kind of shared what we were thinking, and then
I didn't know that.
and she shared what she thought about it, and helped us a lot.
And I hadn't realized like the extent of their friendship at the time. I mean, I knew that they were friendly. Kristi was helping out in my class, sort of in a teaching assistant capacity. And so she was not always there, but regularly, coming in and helping to facilitate the course content. And so I knew they were friendly, but I didn't realize the extent of it right away. But then it became pretty obvious that they had found this connection, which I think many women hope to find at some point in their life, especially as an adult, to be able to find a friendship that is so supportive, both personally and professionally. And so when they came to me, they were describing this, and if I recall, the conversation was a little more like, is there something here? Is this worth, like looking into? And for me, it was an absolute yes. I said, I don't know quite where to look, but yeah, I think that there is, and if it's important to you, I have no doubt that it's important to other women too. So so it started with that lunch conversation, but it was kind of wide open in terms of, I think, what direction it would take, and I don't think any of us imagined how it ended up.
I think even the fact that we thought, Robin, I mean, yes, we wanted her to be part of the call, the paper, because she has expertise in this field more so than we did, but also just we wanted to go to her to validate that this was a worthy subject of research. And I think in looking at some of the literature that we looked at, that was a similar theme of not knowing when you first come in, are your ideas worthy of research? Do they rise to that level of scientific inquiry? So I think that just reflects itself how precarious we felt in the university.
Thank you for sharing that. And I don't want to assume this, but I was also very curious. I want to know what role might friendships, which you have talked to, which you've touched on, might have played in the experience of developing this manuscript.
Sorry, could you repeat that last part again?
So what role might friendships have played in the experience of developing this manuscript? If you could connect that back with, some of the great insights you're talking about in the article, but I think people also would be curious, as Robin said, that these are, that these are not friendships that we can take for granted, and yet when they do occur, it's a gift, not just a not just for professional outcomes, but also there are personal outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, just doing the work itself, it was so exciting and it felt so much fun to do it. Like, even, you're reading if you're reading a lot of papers, like, yes, it's fun to learn new things and read about people's ideas, but sometimes it's tiring. But with this, I just felt this like motivation to do it. I would like text Kristi long messages and she would be texting me back and it would be like 10:30 at night, because you're like, oh, I just thought about this. And I hadn't had that experience before. So it just like made me feel like really excited about the work. And then just obviously like we would get together and spend time together. So it was, personally super fulfilling to have that. And then thinking like, oh, this could be part of my work. I could have these types of relationships, so that was really rewarding.
And I think that goes back to what we saw in a lot of the studies that we reviewed for the paper as well, was that women were experiencing joy, like that word was used quite a bit in their work and research. And so I think it really like sparks more of a internal motivation to work on scholarly activity when you're doing it with a friend, and it's a topic that you really have internalized as being worthy instead of somebody from the outside or your department kind of dictating what it is that you research.
Yeah, and I also think too, I could see in the communications that I was a part of, whether that was a text or an email or something, I could see the shorthand that the two of them would be using too. So they were able to cut through a lot of the layers that come with sort of professional collaborations. They didn't have to build trust. They already had it. They didn't have to set clear expectations because they already had, expectations for each other. And so you could see their ability to move towards sort of producing something much more quickly, I think, than sometimes if you just have professional collaborators coming together. But I also think that, Emma's very kind to say it was such a joy. There was a lot of rejection.
Yeah.
Which I think we'll get to later, but there was a lot of rejection. And I wondered if the strength of their friendship allowed them to be have grace, like be kind to each other, be appreciative of what they had produced in spite of the rejection, and maybe were willing to keep going because it wasn't just an academic pursuit for them. It was more of a reflection of their experience in a lot of ways. And so I think, sort of as the third wheel in observing that I think it made a great difference in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There were times when I wanted to throw in the towel for sure when we had some rejections, and you put a lot of work in, and so this was my first time really submitting a manuscript at this point. So I didn't know how long it can take, and that maybe 3 years is actually a pretty normal timeline for writing a manuscript and getting it to publication. But Emma was, so if I was feeling kind of, like, let's just give up on this, Emma would build me back up, and kind of vice versa. So another benefit of doing work with your friends.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that sharing. I was also curious because in a sense, the way both of you came in, your starting points were as students primarily. Would that be fair assessment? Yeah. And then Robin, could you talk a little bit more about how you saw your role in supporting, supporting students, especially at the start of the project, and then how this turned out to be the collaboration it became?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So both these women are very capable scholars. I got to go to Emma's defense, and I was blown away as a philosophy scholar. It's like a whole new world, and I was totally impressed. So, and working with Kristi as closely as I was in the department, I knew that the two of them could create something pretty spectacular. And so after that lunch meeting, or I think maybe during the lunch meeting, it was kind of like I think at some point they asked for my input but I hadn't officially joined the project because I was looking back at my email notes, and at one point they did ask if I'd like to join along, and I said that I would be happy to, but I really saw my role as sort of a shepherd, sort of helping them when they needed it, giving them direction if they needed it, or reassurance. But I originally took a pretty back seat and gave input when asked and that kind of thing. And help point in the right direction. And I think after, what was it, the third rejection, the third different journal rejection, we kind of came back together and said, all right, so now what? And I said, I'd offer to take a stab if we wanted to, kind of go in a slightly different direction and frame it for more of an HRD audience, because I had experience publishing in HRD, and I explained what that would look like and how how that may or may not work for them, and so I took on a bigger role at that point, just helping them to frame it for an HRD audience a bit more than they had been in the past. But the good thing was, at that point, we had actually gotten some pushback about putting friendships at the center of the paper. And so although much of the feedback we got in our rejections was quite helpful, and we used it to publish in the end, we found that we were moving farther and farther away from this notion of friendship, and so when we sat down to refocus and reframe for HRD, I think we recommitted, and I kind of said, I think this is a good thing. I think it's worth trying again, and and then I think we all kind of built on our strengths and worked collaboratively on putting it together and making lots of revisions and giving lots of feedback along the way, which was really helpful, because for the time that it went under review for HRDR, that was at the beginning of the pandemic, and so that was a very stressful period, and so it was nice to have such great co-authors who, we all stepped in, I think, when others couldn't, and picked up the slack to make sure that it kept going. And hopefully I got that right, Kristi and Emma.
Yeah, I think we'll just add that, like, a big part of Robin's guidance was kind of making explicit some of those things about the research and publication process that Emma and I just didn't have experience with. So, for instance, getting pushback on using our own personal story in the paper, that was something that I felt strongly about, but probably would have deferred to the reviewers. But, Robin kind of coached us through, like, there are things that you get to say, like, no, this is absolutely essential to me. And if they're pushing you to do something that you really feel strongly about, then maybe that's not the journal. And, kind of talking through some of those, things that are not really explicit in, like, curriculum when you're a PhD student, but you need somebody with experience to kind of talk you through.
Mm-hmm. I think too, like, when we got rejections, the fact that, Robin was so calm, and just assured us, like, oh, we will try again. And, so I think that was very helpful, because it modeled that it was okay, and that we should, be resilient, and we keep going.
And I had to, it was a good relationship for me to learn through as well, because I was working really hard to be explicit. And I don't think I totally realized that until, getting ready for this interview. I kind of looked back through emails and stuff, and I'd say, like, this is what I'd suggest, and this is why I'm suggesting it, which I think is a piece that maybe a more veteran author or veteran scholar might offer the advice, but not really getting at the why of it. And so I think in some cases I did an okay job with that, but I'm still working on it. But I think that it really helped, because I realized that this was not just about publishing a manuscript. It was really about helping them learn how to do this so that they can do it without me. And I think they could have figured it out. It just might have taken longer.
I think what's fascinating about the topic is also the title. And I was curious if there's something you wanted to share about how you came about the title.
That was all Robin. That was her brilliant idea.
Meera, do you know that the HRDR reviewers weren't too keen on it?
I think they wanted us to maybe make it more explicit why the F word was, we had to kind of point out that it's because of this paucity of that word being used in the literature that it makes it sort of a scandalous word to say. So I don't know if we had articulated that as well in the initial manuscript.
Yes, yeah, that's probably accurate, but yeah, I think that it was like a way to capture the taboo that we were starting to kind of understand, maybe not explicitly, but it was implicit in a lot of the literature we were looking at. You know, when we were reading, and there was always this framing as mentorship, mm-hmm. But you know, the two of them would be reading, they're like, but this doesn't sound like mentorship, it sounds like friendship, you know, and they go, but look at the friendship literature, it says this is what defines a friend, and this is what it is. And so we kept seeing that idea that why, you know, that people were avoiding either disclosing friendships or calling something a friendship. And so, you know, it just became sort of this taboo kind of idea. And so nothing more taboo than the F word around here.
And I think too, we had some personal experience there where, for example, you know, I had been told, and Kristi and I had talked about this, like, you don't share ideas with other grad students. They might steal your ideas. So if you have that type of framework, you know, then you're not going to want maybe to make friends in the same way. Whereas, you know, if you're encouraged to, you know, share your ideas, talk about them, and collaborate, it's not a competition always, right? Then friendships can grow from there. So I think that's something that we felt strongly, that we felt like friendships should be taken seriously because they are so they can be so generative.
I also think one last thing is that as scholars, you know, I think that there's some power in the title, and the more you can make a title accessible and of interest to people who aren't, you know, scholars or aren't academic geeks, then everybody benefits. You know, I know that people that are you know, have a subscription to HRDR are, you know, going to read it or going to have access to it. But I think that our title had a lot to do with lots of other people, like through social media, taking the time to sort of click on it because they were like, well, that sounds interesting, but also maybe accessible to people who aren't steeped in that literature.
Yeah, it's a good hook.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's so good. That's what hooked me on to the article the first time I saw it. I said, ooh, we need more of that. And there you all touched on sort of like the collaborative process itself. So, you know, writing. So Emma and Kristi, you talked about the text messages exchange between the both of you, sort of like, you know, it nourished that friendship, it kept that going forward, and then how you invited Robin to be a part of the journey. So in terms of if you can briefly touch on your own working styles, because I think sometimes that can be very helpful, especially, you know, the arc of this particular article and this journey that you all taken seems like it wasn't, you know, it found a home, but how, you know, how the manuscript itself found a home itself is a bigger story. And it's also reflective of the content of your article as well, and how, you know, so it's like I feel there are a lot of layers to your all's experience. So, but then specifically, can you talk about working styles? Like if you had to give advice and tips, especially when you get the sort of feedback you got, not just from HRDR, but previous other journal outlets that you were trying to find a better home or a different home and a different audience? What would be some advice and tips for anyone who wants to either jump in or who might be veterans in the publication process? But it's not like it gets easy. But so, what advice do you have for us?
All right. Well, I think in the beginning, Emma and I had a lot of sort of initial brainstorming sessions. And so we would meet over wine back when people were going out and meeting in places together. And we would first started, I think, as conversation, and then we'd have some working sessions. So we would bring our laptops to a restaurant. I'm sure we annoyed the other patrons there. And we actually identified some articles that way, and then we would kind of split them up. We had a shared Google Drive where we had, for each study that we were reviewing, we have sort of like a cheat sheet where we could give an overview of the study and some of the key points of it, and then how that related to our research questions. So I definitely think organizationally, you have to have some kind of system that works for you. For us, the collaborative documents that are so accessible and widely used now was a big part of that. And I think we were pretty explicit about like who would do what, and we had those conversations early on as well. Am I missing anything, Emma, in our process?
No, I was just going to say too, once we had kind of started to writing it more, Kristi's very productive, so she would write a lot, and then I would, go in and make, and that's why Google Docs was so nice, because you can make comments without interfering with the other person's writing, which was really nice. So I thought that worked really well for us. And then also in terms of having like a little cheat sheet, because I know that Robin had told us kind of talk through how to create that cheat sheet so that it would be like something that would work well, as we wanted to refer back to it. So that was very helpful to do it that way. And then, when Robin was also writing, again, it was really nice to have that Google Doc set up so that we could see who wrote what and kind of process it together in the comments on the side of the document.
Yeah, I think when this started in 2017, I don't think I'd been using Google Docs really all that much. I mean, I knew of them, and I had, had them as a repository for groups and things like that. But it was the first time that I had really truly started a project with others in that way through Google Docs. And now I don't know how I'd live without it. But but at the time it was sort of a new frontier for me. So they helped me in that respect. But yeah, they. I think that Kristi, was certainly our fearless leader in helping us to put the pieces together. But as you pointed out, and we've mentioned, HRDR was not the first place that Kristi and Emma kind of turned to. Originally, I think that they had conceptualized it as just looking sort of at this notion of friendship in higher ed. And higher ed was sort of just the context, right? Like that it was about this notion of friendship and support. And so they had originally been looking at journals that were more focused on gender and women's experiences broadly, and then a little more into they shifted a little more into context into higher ed. And so so when it first started, it was framed very differently, simply because they hadn't considered, or hadn't meant to consider kind of the work piece of it, right? They were just trying to capture sort of what do we mean when we say friendships in academia. So in each case, they kind of changed lanes slightly. They were always going in the same direction, but changed lanes and were able to adapt pretty flawlessly with each iteration. But I think it got better with the support of reviewers from the journals that took the time to review the article and give really helpful and constructive feedback. They weren't horrible rejections. No. They were actually quite constructive. But most of the time it came down to not quite the right fit. Or not quite right for what they generally publish in terms of structure, because it was much more conceptual or essay, right? Was that essay was our original word?
Well, originally too, we had it as a literature review, so it did make a big shift toward a conceptual paper. And so I think that you were really helpful in that process too, Robin, and kind of pointing out like when do we kind of give up on this notion of a literature review. And I was actually more excited, I think, by writing a conceptual paper. So I think that kind of like liberated us from like feeling like we had to stick with what we originally started with, because the feedback was that people weren't as interested in literature reviews. It seemed like.
Yeah. On a side note, just like a funny story, when so Kristi did her like research study in one of my philosophy classes, and I work at the Stanford campus, so I have to take the train there. We would take the train together, and it was great because we could like talk about our ideas and the paper. And I wonder sometimes what people were thinking like on the train that would hear us talk about what we were working on. So yeah, that was a good time.
So I think in some sense you might have answered this, but I'm going to still share that if you wanted any additional insight or an advice or a tip or some tool that folks can benefit. So in terms of the literature review process itself, and identifying what kinds of frameworks would fit or would help in moving the conversation forward in your paper. So talk about literature review, and then I think the strength of your paper is the conceptual framework that are identified, and that helped to bring even a more sharper focus in terms of what could be the insights, especially in higher education, in academia, and I think that comes through. So can you talk a little bit about how did you manage all of that within the literature review piece? How did you come to these theoretical frameworks? Was that what helped you do that?
Yeah, sure. I can start with that. So I'm not really sure exactly when we first stumbled on relational cultural theory, but when we did, it seemed like such a great fit for what we were seeing in the literature and what we wanted to put forth as our position, which was that people were really growing and experiencing well-being because of the relationships that they had with other people. And I think that theory was kind of, at the time that it was developed, in contrast to this notion of like you develop and then you reach a point where you're independent and you no longer need people anymore. And so it was more about getting this energy, this zest, this enthusiasm, and personal well-being from your relationship. So that just seemed so apt to what we were thinking and seeing in the literature. And also it helped us to sort of differentiate what is sort of just like a workplace acquaintance or relationship and what is actually a friendship. And so there were these qualities within relational cultural theory, like reciprocity and authenticity, that we felt were good ways to kind of look at the literature and say, okay, are they meeting these criteria? If so, then we would call that friendship. And then for self-determination theory, that came later, and that was really, I think, through the encouraging of the editors of HRDR, they were telling us that we should really bolster our theoretical contribution and underpinnings. And so I just happened to be at the time like reading some literature about well-being and self-actualization and some psychology literature. And it just sort of dawned, I think, on us that the way that the reason why these relationships are so nurturing is because they're meeting these human needs that are going unmet in a work environment in which you feel marginalized. So feeling confident, feeling related to other people, feeling autonomous. So that was sort of just this realization that helped us, I think, bring the paper together in a really powerful way.
And so I think in a lot of ways, it started with what you would expect it to start with. There was some Googling, there was, some searching through the literature, like, okay, what happens, because none of us had been working in friendship areas, we hadn't been studying friendships. And so we're like, all right, so, what does exist? And starting there, that was really helpful. But I think that, as Kristi points out, reading broadly and thinking broadly beyond, one particular concept or scope really helped us. I think, like in particular, Kristi and I, coming from adult learning backgrounds, we were thinking, oftentimes in similar directions, and helping her at the time with her dissertation. So, we were entrenched in particular literatures. But I, recall a couple of times where we turned to Emma and we're like, all right, you're the philosopher. What does philosophy say about friendship? And it was really super, super insightful and helpful because she framed it quite differently than I had ever thought about framing it, or, and brought in literature and pointed us in directions that allowed us to make new discoveries, to create the conceptual framework, that ultimately led to, to the paper.
This is great too, because Kristi was a philosophy undergrad, right? Yes, you were. Yeah. So we would always talk about, philosophy just in general. So it was nice to have that kind of shared background to talk about the different ideas and ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. What we'll do now is we'll focusing on the patients aspect of your paper, and I wanted us to really look at.
They're breaking up a little bit, Meera. Is everybody else hearing that too? Yeah.
Breaking up a little bit. Yep.
Yeah.
Let me try again. So what we'll do now is is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So what we'll do now is we'll move towards the findings and the implications part of your publication. And really, I wanted us to think about, in thinking about findings, how do you describe women's friendships as it exists in academia now? Like, just based on what you know from your own experiences. And then can you talk about what you're finding in your findings in the paper, and then we can start talking about what else can we do, what possible interventions can happen or occur in the workplace.
Get us started. So in terms of friendship, as Robin said, when we looked at the literature, we didn't actually see that word being used too often. It was in some cases, but often we turned to the peer mentoring literature. And then there would be like women's writing groups or research groups. And so we, use our criteria of friendship to determine whether we thought that was friendship or not. And I mean, it was pretty explicit. People were talking about their relationships with these women at work, giving them a space to breathe, and it was very powerful, the language that they were using. And we started to see that women were really creating these what we call counter spaces in the paper, these areas where they could be together and kind of have their own values that weren't the same values as the academic environment. So they described really wanting a more egalitarian kind of relationship. They didn't always feel comfortable disclosing some of their concerns and fears to their, direct supervisor, or even like a mentor that is in a higher position than they were. And so it was, very much about sharing power, also bringing in emotional issues, which you probably wouldn't do in the workplace, or they felt was taboo to do in the workplace. So very inclusive of emotional support, and really recognizing how your personal life does affect your professional performance too. And that those weren't values or ways of working that they were seeing in the larger institutional context.
And I think given our position as women in academia, and certainly with Emma and Kristi's friendships, and my own friendship, with women in academia, I think that in some way we were able to validate and see the authenticity in that, in those examples, and things that weren't called friendships were going. So, that when we say it sounded an awful lot like friendships, yes, it was based on the criteria, but we also kind of held it up to our own mirror of what we understood friendship to be in our own experience, and I think that helped us to feel more confident that what we were seeing really was friendship, and that we weren't just imagining, or it was some isolated, freaky incident that you end up with a friend at work. So that was really, I think that was helpful to as a means to kind of check and balance our own interpretations of the literature.
Is there anything else you'd like to share, Emma, to that description?
No, I mean, I guess just to go back to the point I did mentioned initially about not feeling like an academic, that was something that it seemed like people were feeling, that through these relationships and this kind of shared, power that you had, that was something that could flourish. So people did feel more confident and, productive, and then had this like identity affirmed. So that was something that stood out to me just because it really mirrored how I felt personally. Mm-hmm.
I think you all touch on that too, the imposter syndrome and all of the other ways in which when women do feel, isolated, or because, additional ways because of their identities, that finding that peer support outside of formal mentorship or buddying opportunities, outside of that, how do you find it? And finding that is not straightforward, or it seems like it is more serendipitous. But then but in talking about, what are the ways in which our own workplaces, we all work for higher education, and, in our own, what can leaders do differently to promote and nourish these friendships, so that then that overall, that not only helps productivity, that's important, but relatedness, autonomy, having a sense of competence, which is so crucial for being successful, also feeling fulfilled in our jobs and roles. So what are some key practical implications if you had to take it to a dean, take it to a department chair and say, we want some things to change? What should that look like?
I mean, one thing personally is that I think, and that we've talked about, is just making it possible for people to collaborate and not thinking less of that work that's being produced, that it's not less than if you spearhead a project on your own that you're presenting on, for example. So to really encourage your employees to collaborate and work on projects, because that's just something that I see in my own, academic advising work. That's something that we are encouraged to do. And it definitely is something that makes me enjoy what I do every day, and has allowed me to, build strong friendships with my colleagues, which overall, I think you're more likely to ask for help if you feel comfortable with who you're working with, which obviously, like, if you ask for help and can make sure you do something correctly that you weren't sure about, I think that's something that should be in the best interest of a supervisor. So.
And Meera, you said, it's sort of serendipitous, and while it is, it isn't. We talk about sort of being in proximity of people to build that friendship, to build that trust. And I think that a lot of folks are seeing the real importance of that these days, because we're all, sort of isolated, as this interview demonstrates, right? Which is, in our own conversations, we're thinking it's probably pretty detrimental to friendship development in the workplace, or can certainly inhibit it. So you need a work environment where people have the opportunity to be in close proximity, to be able to work together, as Emma says, and to be able to collaborate, but also to create a culture where that proximity is understood and welcomed, or at least accepted, because sometimes people that are hanging out in each other's office might look like they're just sitting back and shooting the breeze, and they're being more friends than they are professionals at that time, and that might be frowned upon. But as Emma and Kristi were talking, like being on the train, it might have looked like two friends, just chatting, but what you find is that they were working on knowledge creation the whole time, and being quite productive, right? So not being too quick to judge what you see, and the sort of the I don't know, the title, or how you're characterizing that relationship, positively or negatively. Just let people be, and I think the work will come.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to that too, the studies that we looked at were often from early career researchers or women who held multiple marginalized identities, so women of color, Latina women. There was a few Latina research and writing groups that we pulled from. And I think it speaks to how, especially if you are in a time of transition or you're an early career, new to a place, I'm experiencing right now in my job role, then that kind of heightens the need for social connection. And so I think, from a leadership perspective, kind of recognizing which people might benefit even more from having those opportunities built in, or having that proximity or that room for those spontaneous interactions to lead to friendship, kind of be an architect of friendship, is helpful, because, and that's something backed up in the literature too, that in times of stress and in transition, we need that connection more so.
Yeah, like, I think at one point in our discussions along the way too, I pointed out that for me, I had a very young child when I started in my faculty position. And so the friendships that I developed early on here at UConn were really super important in that respect, that I was turning to other mother academics to really, to help me navigate both of those identities, right? That my work identity and my mother identity. And so, that was another kind of way of framing it. But I don't think any of us are suggesting that friendships are only important to women. I think that if you change culture and you encourage friendships, that it's going to benefit anyone who wants to be friends, right? It's going to benefit everyone, and and by extension, it's going to benefit the organization. So we could all use more friends.
Absolutely. I think also this brings me to another a conversation I had with a colleague at State University, is looking at Latina women in STEM, and she's a part of a bigger NSF grant. And so talking about relationships, friendships and networks, especially for women who might have, in addition to our gender, and what else are we bringing to the table that can either create, create a different set of challenges, or barriers or access to resources, networks, professional networks. It was interesting, and what she's looking at is authorships and publications, and seeing what are the different kinds of collaborations are possible in publications. So are women scholars networking more, working with different faculty from diverse disciplines? Is that more diverse in the work they produce? How similar or different is it with men? And there's some fascinating findings, I think.
Wow, it's interesting. Yeah, I know we came across as some research that women were more likely to produce with co-authors than men were. But then in a lot of tenure promotion processes, it is valued more highly to have a single authorship. So it's another way that women's ways of working are maybe not being institutionalized.
Mm-hmm. And one thing just that I thought of now, really that Kristi and I met each other was because they were promoting taking classes, for example, in different departments. Otherwise, maybe, if I didn't sign up for that class, it's likely I wouldn't have met Kristi. So I think that goes just in general to allow people to work together from, different departments, whether that's in academia or in another setting.
Thank you for that. So I think we touched on, so key insights of publication, from the publication that we can take to our leaders, and takeaways for anyone and everyone watching the interviews, right? So men, women, everyone. We've got a lot. There's lots from this article to talk about how we can continue to build relationships, have a sense of relatedness. The last part is really about future directions for this exciting work. I mean, there is so much that you could involve. So really talk to us about your plans. How are you going to extend this line of research? Because there's going to be a lot of benefits for so many people.
So now that
Yeah.
Kristi has completed her dissertation and has a job.
It's important. Yeah, I mean, the question that I have been most drawn to, and I think Robin and Emma are right there with me. I sent them an email a couple weeks ago, like, "Are you interested in working on this with me?" And they both were. So, the question is about sort of how women's friendships go beyond helping them to navigate and to thrive personally and professionally in the work environment to actually enacting some institutional change or departmental change. Because we did see a bit of that in the literature, that women felt because of their relationships, they were able to kind of speak up or resist in certain ways. And so I'm really curious to see like how those relationships might be leading to some changes. And we just don't know the backstory of how that came to be. And I suspect there's a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
I mean,
oh, sorry, Emma.
No, I was just going to say, we're meeting today to talk about it.
Yes, we are. Yeah, so I think, yeah, the next step is more of a, an empirical focus and try to kind of better understand the friendships role in not just supporting each other, but doing good that goes beyond the pair people that are involved. And Kristi and I've had sort of wild conversations too, sitting in my office too, about the possibilities that that we look at lots of different kinds of environments, not just in higher ed, but try to understand does this notion of friendship look the same, say in a I don't know, a stockbroker kind of hedge fund company, as it does in higher ed, and or does it look different in K-12 schools versus schools of higher ed? That those kinds of ideas are really, to me, quite interesting. And from an adult learning perspective, I'm really curious about what people learn through those friendships as well.
Certainly anecdotally, we've had people kind of reach out and say, this is true for me and I work in politics or I work in journalism. So we suspect that it's definitely a cross-disciplinary phenomenon.
Yep.
Well, that was my set of questions that we had for you. Is there anything else, last thoughts, comments, reactions, anything you wanted to say that I haven't asked and I probably should have? Now's your chance.
I guess just one thing, I would say that, Kristi and I think we were inspired too by this one podcast called Your Girlfriend with Anne Friedman and Amina Tissot. And they talk a lot about their friendship, and they started a podcast, because they lived in different cities. So that has really been something that inspired us. And we did reach out to them when our paper was published, and they shared it in their newsletter. So we got a lot of interaction through that. And I just thought that was really cool. It was an awesome experience to see them like validate our work too. So that was just something I wanted to highlight.
One other thing too is I want to acknowledge sort of the developmental process too. In terms of an HRD context, this began as a sort of a working paper presentation at UFHRD in 2018, I think is what it was. Mm-hmm. And that was, I think, a really important step. We got some reassuring feedback from people that we admire, and I recall, I think I'm correct, that like Karen Watkins sat in on our session, and when she pulled us aside or came to us at the end and said, that sounds a lot like my friendship with Victoria Marsick, that to me was like, okay, then we're on the right track, right? Like that what we're doing has a place and has a significance that maybe we didn't fully realize, that we started to hear from others through that initial presentation, that they could see themselves in it. So that was really great. And then, although, you know, as we mentioned, there were some other journals along the way. When it went to HRDR, one of the things that I think was notable for us was HRDR's commitment to shepherding us through that process. You know, it was encouraging to get the revise and resubmit and to be able to integrate the reviewer's suggestions. But then it wasn't an automatic, you're good to go. They came back and said, not quite. They wanted just a little bit more revise and resubmit. And so we actually went through two stages of that. And so I think that was really useful because it demonstrated to us that the reviewers and the editors saw the potential in it. And weren't willing to just sort of let it go, and were really supportive and directing us to create the best article that we could. And they got the full spectrum of the manuscript preparation process.
Well, yeah, and I think for early career researchers, maybe anybody, when you initially get feedback, your instinct might be to be a little upset or defensive about it. But I honestly am really grateful for, especially the last piece of feedback, to strengthen the theoretical and conceptual piece of it, because it just gave a green light to do that. And I think, you know, there was a little bit of timidity before that. So it completely worked. You know, the peer review process does work, and if you can approach it with an open mind, maybe like let the feedback settle for a few days and then go back to it when you're not feeling.
There was a lot of wine, I think.
A lot of wine.
That helps too. But once you can see how constructive it actually is, to embrace that, because it is a stronger paper now, undoubtedly, because of the feedback from the peer review process and from the editors.
And call your friend in between, you know, for support.
Yep. Yeah. Friendships, calling your friend helps a lot.
I think that's going to be the theme, not just for, I mean, it's always been a running theme, and I think folks have not paid attention to it before. So I think that's the power of your article, with the title, with the hook, as you said, Kristi, the right hook. And a very deserving hook, because this article needs all of the attention and love, with all kinds of different audiences. And I hope it'll do that. And I'm very confident that it's going to do that too. So thank you all for excellent work. I mean, I'm glad it got the award. I couldn't be more proud of the fact to be associated indirectly with all of the work that you have done. And also, my plan is actually to share this work in a doctoral class I'm teaching, and also sharing the interview, because I think there are so many insights and tips from here today that I was thinking, as I was going through, I was like, check, teaching.
I think we really hope that other scholars in HRD and adult learning in higher ed, find the connection to it, because I think we all believe that friendships can be foundational to a lot of the work that is going on. You know, we can look at our colleagues who are doing, working in employee well-being and in retention, and inclusive practices. All of these bigger ideas really have their roots in how people feel and who they're working with, and knowing that they have a place in an organization.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.